Hello and welcome to part 4 of our Scorpion build. I've started on the fuel system, also a bit on the exhaust and radiator and stuff like that, but I'll show you all those bits in a minute. With the fuel system, what I like to do is to make a self-contained swirl pot, lift pump, everything in one. And what I've done, made this bracket which bolts up onto the chassis rail and holds our swirl pot. There's already one bolted in there. And then our swirl pot bolts up in there. There's not very many places that you can put stuff in these little cars, but there's just enough room there to get all of that in, miss the back of the diff and all that sort of thing. Now, I've got one of these prepared, which I'll show you now. So this is what it looks like when it's all assembled. I've got the high pressure pump inside. This is a Suzuki Samara top, but I've put a big pump in it. I've replaced the Suzuki pump. The little lift pump's just bolted to the outside, and that all fits up inside there. So once all the hoses and the wiring's connected, that's pretty much this end of the fuel system done. So the lift pump just sucks the fuel out of the original fuel tank, so we don't have to modify the tank, pumps it into the swirl pot, EFI pump inside, pumps it through to the front of the vehicle. I've got the swirl pot all bolted in now. I've got all the hoses connected, so it tucks up in there. There's not a lot of room for it, but there's enough. Little lift pump here that fills up our swirl pot. The high pressure pump's inside. So the only thing to do now is to finish off the wiring. So I've got to run a wire from the front of the car, from the fuel pump relay, all the way to the back here to power up our two pumps. With the fuel system, I've already got the swirl pot and the high pressure pump and everything mounted in the back. So now it's time to have a look at the front. This is your standard Windsor fuel rail, and you can see the fuel pressure regulator sticks up there. Now, problem with using this is I want to turn the plenum around the opposite side, so the throttle body's on this side, not on this side where the battery's going to be. So this would normally sit more or less like that. These two lines come off, and they come off this side. So I'd like to hide the lines as well and put those at the back. So what I do is I cut the rails up. That's my modified rail there. It actually fits that way round. The fuel pressure reg now sits horizontally, and the return line comes off the back and goes across the back behind the cylinder head, so you don't even see it. This is the left-hand side, and this is the inlet side now. So the fuel comes in, comes out this one. There'll be a crossover hose to go in between the two, and then leaves and goes back to the tank. So I've had those zinc plated so that because they're always rusty, so they look a little bit better. So that's the next thing to do with the fuel system. In the previous video, I said I make my own handbrake cables. One of the tricks is to attach the ferrule onto the end of your cable. Now, if you just get the oxy out and you start heating the cable out, the danger is that you're going to burn the little individual wires that the cable's made up of. So you need to have some way of being able to slip your ferrule on, but keep the rest of the cable from overheating. Now, easiest way I've found to do this is I use this little old machine vise that I've got. So what I do is, just by coincidence, there's a little groove in this vise as well. So I put the cable in, and just, it doesn't have to be very tight, just nip up onto the cable and then slip your little ferrule on. Now what that does is this acts like a heat sink and keeps the heat away from the cable, rest of the cable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weld this with manganese bronze. You can do it with silver solder, which takes less heat, but for the purposes of the demonstration I'm going to use the manganese bronze because that's at a higher temperature. So I'm going to get this little ferrule glowing red hot, and I'll show you how it doesn't really affect the cable. Now, if you just heat the cable up with the oxy, I'll just do a little demo here, you can see that just the individual strands get pretty hot pretty quickly. And of course the danger is that when you're trying to silver solder it, that the little individual strands burn up completely. So I'm going to put this back in the vise now, put the ferrule on, and I'll show you how this works. All right, so I've got a little bit of cable sticking through there. The rest of the vise will act as a heat sink. I've got my little ferrule here. Now with the little ferrule, you want to put a decent sized countersink in there so that the bronze has got somewhere to pool into. So we just slip that onto there. And then what I like to do is to just give the end of it a bit of a squash up. So now it's actually bigger than the hole in the ferrule. And when the bronze runs into it and runs into all the little fibers, even if the weld breaks, it can't possibly come off. Okay, so I'm using manganese bronze rods here, which take a fair bit of temperature to get them to melt. Also make a very good joint, very strong joint. Now I'm going to heat up the little ferrule here, and I'm going to get that really glowing red, which if you did with the cable not cooled by the vise here, it would actually burn it up pretty severely. So as you can see, we've got a fair bit of heat there into our little ferrule, and now I'm going to go in with the bronze. Okay, that's welded on there now. You can see it's pretty hot. Now we wouldn't need to be that hot if you're using silver solder, but it's called silver solder for a reason, because it's nowhere near as strong as bronze welding. Silver solder is also ridiculously expensive for a rod. Anyway, I'll let that cool down a little bit and I'll show you it when it's cooled. Well, it's all done. There it is, and as you can see, we haven't burnt up the cable. We've got plenty of bronze in the top there. Once I grind that off, that'll go into the hole that it's supposed to go into, although this is just a demonstration piece. But that's the way to do it if you don't have the proper crimping tools. The ones that go straight on the end, and that's parallel with the cable, those you can crimp on. But if you don't have the proper crimping pliers and that sort of thing, then this is a good alternative. This is a good way to do it. Years ago, when I was doing a lot of intercooler piping and that sort of thing, I made up this little thing for putting the bead on the end of the pipe, but also works quite well for making radiator outlets. So you can put a bead on it so the hose doesn't come off. So I'm just going to slip that on there, a little bit tight. And around we go. Years ago when I made this, these things were quite expensive to buy, and I couldn't bring myself to spend the amount of money, so I spent ages making this one up. Probably would have been cheaper to buy the thing rather than making it myself. Anyway, it does a pretty good job. There we go. That's done. Oh, come on. So, there's our little bubble rolled onto the end. For the radiator, I use these VK Commodore radiators. They're 50mm thick, all aluminium, and well and truly up to the job of these little motors. The problem is that the outlets are the wrong size. They're in approximately the right position, they're just not the right size. So I cut off the originals and then I make up my own to go on. So I'll just put this down and I'll show you the little outlets. So that's one like you saw me roll before, and that's the right size for the top outlet or water back into the radiator. So that's the top one. And the bottom one, a little bit more complicated. It's got to have a bend in it and it's got to be welded on at just the right angle. Now, what I use is a universal bottom hose, which I can't get off. It's just a 90-degree hose. And by putting about a 30-degree angle in that and then welding it to the radiator at just the right position, it clears the chassis rail and mates up with the hose. So rather than trying to find a hose to suit the radiator, I find this is a better way to go. Yes, it does mean you've got to do a bit of aluminium welding, but if you're trying to do this at home, I'm afraid you'd have to take your radiator to an engineering shop that welds aluminium and get those welded on. So I'll just pop that back in there. So that just drops in there. That is the top outlet, that'll get welded on there. And what I've found is this is the perfect radiator hose for it. It's a Subaru Impreza 2.2 litre F4 petrol engine, EJ201. But what a good fit. That's a nice fit onto the thermostat housing, and it lines up really nicely with the radiator there. So that's worked out really, really well. And as I say, the bottom one is just a universal 90-degree bend. So I'll get those all welded on, and that'll be the radiator done. So I've got my radiator ready here. I've welded on the new outlets to suit the Ford-sized hoses. I've actually done a couple of them, a couple for stock, and I've got one sitting in here in the car now. So with the bottom hose, I buy these Gates hoses. They're a universal hose. The little white lines are there to give you a bit of a guide when you cut them. So what I do is I cut the hose down to about that size there, which actually leaves a handy bit of straight hose if you need it for something else. But that's it, that's all we need now for a bottom hose. That fits on perfectly. For the top hose, I'm using this Subaru hose. This is a Subaru Impreza 2 litre EJ201. And surprising enough, it's just about a perfect fit on here. So I just pop that on there, and that on there. Couldn't ask for much better than that. So it's pretty good. I've got the alternator down low enough so it doesn't get in the way of anything. So that's a pretty good fit. I'm onto the exhaust part of it now. I've got quite a bit of it made right up to the rear muffler here. Now I'm up to the part where we go up and over the diff. So that pipe there will go up and over, and then I'll put a little resonator back here and the tailpipe. I bought a whole bunch of these mandrel bends, and they're all in stainless steel. I like to make the system in stainless steel so that it's done once, it's done forever. So we've got a catalytic converter in there because this will be fuel injected. It's a late model motor, so it has to have the catalytic converter as well. So that should give us a nice, fairly quiet, but definitely give us the V8 rumble and a legal exhaust system. Exhaust system's almost done. It's all tacked together. It's all in stainless steel. Now I've just got to go over it with the TIG and TIG all the joints completely together. But other than that, exhaust system is all done. So the next thing to do is to start on the wiring. We've got to hook up the computer to the injector, well, all of the ECU wiring. So that'll be the next thing, but that'll be in the next video. So thanks again for tuning in.